all. So this week we are going to be learning about extrema. Last week we were learning about end behavior. They do connect, and if you get to the extra credit this week, you'll see exactly how they do connect. So we're going to start by defining what extrema is. So extrema is kind of what it sounds like. It's extreme. So it's, in math-wise, it's a high or a low point on a graph. So with extrema, there's different types. So we're going to do a bunch of vocabulary, and then I'm going to show you some examples. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the maximum. So the maximum, what do we think that sounds like? The max. So the maximum is a high point on a graph. And sometimes, depending on what math site you're on and whatnot, you might hear this called a peak. So, for example, if we're thinking about parabolas and the stuff we've been working with, if we're looking at this, the high point on the graph is this right there. That would be your maximum because it's a high point on the graph. It's where your graph is increasing, then goes to decreasing, that high point. Next, if we're doing the opposite of a maximum, we're going to be doing a minimum. So if a maximum is a high point on a graph, what do we all think the minimum is? It is a low point on a graph. And some people refer to this as a valley. And same thing, if we were to see this, if we had a graph that looked like this right here, that lowest point right there, that would be your minimum. So that's maximum and minimum. But there's different types of maximums and minimums. The first one we're going to talk about is the relative. Or, if you're talking in different sites, it can also be called the local max. And I'm going to put the min in parentheses so I don't have to rewrite this definition twice. So, if we're talking about a max, it's a high. If we're talking about a min, it's a low point that is higher than its surroundings, but not the highest point on the whole graph. So, for example, say we're looking at a graph and it looked like this. So we can see that there's some high points and some low points. So if I was finding a maximum, this right here would be a maximum. But notice, if I was to draw a line where this maximum point is, it hits the graph again. And even if it didn't hit the graph again, nope, there's this arrow. That means even though it's a high point, it's like you're standing on the top of the hill, there's still more points that go higher. So it's a relative or a local maximum. Whereas we can say the same thing about this minimum right here. Again, if I was to draw a line with the whole function, it hits over here. And also there's that arrow even if it didn't hit. So that means it is not the lowest point, so it is a relative minimum. So that's relative. It's like you're on the top of a mountain, but you still keep seeing things going up. Or if you're at the bottom of a river or a valley, and you still keep seeing things that are lower than you. So what if you were at the top of the mountain and there was nothing above you? That is called the absolute, or the global max. And again, I'm going to put min in parentheses. So the absolute is the very highest if you're talking about the max, or the very lowest if you're talking about the min point on a graph. So in the relative, there's points that were higher or lower, but with absolute, there's not. So let's say we see a graph, and it looks something like this. Well, we can see that there's 2 points that are high right there, but this point is the highest. There's no points that go above it, so this point right here is the absolute maximum. There's nothing else on the graph that goes higher. Whereas, what do we think this point is? What do y'all think? It's a relative minimum, because there's points that still keep going further because it hits over here, and also because of these arrows. Well, there's one more thing that we can see. What do we think this extrema is right here? It's a relative max. So whenever you're finding extrema, there can be multiples. There can be like 20 relative maxes, 20 relative mins, but there can only be one absolute. So it's the very highest point or the very lowest point. So I'm going to show you some examples on Desmos where we're going to practice seeing, can we figure out what is what? All right, so this is Desmos, and this is something right now. So we're going to try to figure out what is the extrema of this. So, first of all, let's click it. We have it here, but what is it? Is it a max, a min, whatever? This is a relative or absolute. What do you think? It is an absolute minimum because there are nothing that goes beneath it. So it's an absolute minimum. All right, let's try another one. So this one. So how many extrema do we see? There's 2. So there's one here and one up here. So what type of extrema is this? It's a relative minimum, because see all this blue here? It keeps going down. What about this one right here? It's a relative maximum, because the graph keeps going up here. Let's try 2 more. All right. Now we have one like this green one. How many extrema does it have? It has 3. It has one right here, and one right there. So I'm going to unclick some of these because it's harder to see. So this one that's clicked right here, what type is it? It's an absolute minimum. There's nothing below it. What about this one? It's a relative maximum because the graph keeps going up. If this was on paper or something, you would see arrows here. So you could tell that it keeps going up forever. And then what about this very last one? It's a relative minimum. And note how all of these, it's giving you the points. So if you were to say it, you would say, I have a relative minimum at whatever. I have a relative maximum at whatever. I have an absolute at whatever. And you would say whatever point it is. And I'm going to write that in the notes after our very last one. So this is our very last one. So, how many extrema do we have here? We actually only have 2. So even though it looks like there might have been an extrema here, it's flat. So remember extrema, it has to be the top of a hill, or it has to be the bottom of a valley. It can't be flat. So what do we think this one is right here? It's a relative minimum. And how we could write that, so how we would write it is we would write a relative min at, and then we would write the point. So if I go back, I would say a relative minimum at negative 1.58, comma, negative 6.19, and that would be a point. So you would write this as a point. The same with the other. So up here, what do we have? We have a relative maximum, and we would write it as a relative maximum at, then we would write this point. So the stuff we are doing this week has to deal with identifying what they are, what their coordinates are, and how we get to see the difference between relative and absolute. So make sure you're letting me know if you have any questions. Hopefully I'll see you in class.